In 2023, Kentucky Governor Andy Beshear pulled off a rare feat, winning re-election by 5 points in a state that Donald Trump carried by 30. His pragmatic, empathetic leadership has positioned him as a Democrat to watch in an era of deep political division and has sparked increased speculation about a potential 2028 presidential run. The governor of Kentucky, Andy Beshear, it's great to have you with us. We so appreciate your time. And I guess the first thing I need to ask you about, Governor, is something that's really dominating the news cycle and has been since last week, and that is the tragic shooting of Charlie Kirk. I'm curious how you see this moment and what it tells you about where we are as a country.
Well, I first see this moment as a human being. I'm a dad of two kids, and I've seen that picture of his young kids, and it hurts me that their dad isn't coming home. That's not fair to those kids. It's not right. And in these moments, being somebody who's lost a very close friend in a mass shooting, the first thing I think about is that family. The second thing is that we've had too many, way too many of these acts of political violence. You had the murder of Charlie Kirk. You had the murder of the former Speaker of the House of the Minnesota legislature, 2 assassination attempts against the president, firebombing of my friend Josh Shapiro's, I guess, the governor's mansion while his family is inside, the plot to assassinate Gretchen Whitmer, and it seems to go on and on. I mean, I remember during the pandemic getting regular threats, sniper threats, and having to exit our Capitol in different ways, having a armed militia walk past all of the barriers at the governor's mansion and pound on the door demanding that I come out. Thankfully, I wasn't there. It's wrong. All of it is wrong, though. And it ought to be that clear. You know, I think right now that leaders have a choice. You can either condemn all violence against anyone, period, full stop, or choose to only condemn violence against people that look like, sound like, and believe in the same things that you do. I mean, what we need right now is leadership that says it is absolutely wrong when it happens to Charlie Kirk, and we should mourn for his family. And it's also absolutely wrong when it happens to the former Speaker of the House in Minnesota. It's just tough for me to believe that somehow partisanship is even delving down in a murder, something just so wrong we should all condemn it.
Do you think that's happening, that Charlie Kirk's murder has become a partisan issue?
Well, I think that you see on social media, which can be toxic, and people can want to try to make some salacious statement. You see some people, I think, trying to make this a partisan issue. I think the vast majority of people don't see it that way. You know, the vast majority of people are mourning for him, whether they agreed or disagreed with him, and then worried that their kids may have seen the video that's out there. But you do see examples of leadership that aren't bringing people together. They're pulling them apart. But then you see great examples of leadership, like the U.S. Senator from Utah that said, let's start taking the word right and left out before the word radical. That if it's wrong on one side, it's wrong on the other, and let's stop trying to attribute that to it.
Well, President Trump seems to have not gotten that message, Governor Beshear. After the shooting, he put the blame squarely on what he described as left-wing radicals before we really knew anything about the shooter. I think even before the shooter had been apprehended. He has doubled down on that assertion ever since. At one point saying, I'm really concerned for our country. We have a great country. We have a radical left group of lunatics out there, just absolute lunatics, and we're going to get that problem solved, whatever that means. That was me, not him. I'm only concerned for the country. Is that an appropriate response to an event like this?
Well, I get that the president is angry. Apparently they had a close relationship, and I remember 2+ years ago getting the call that there was a shooting in my bank where my friends were were working. I remember racing to the scene, and I remember asking one of the people I know on the scene, just saying my friend's name and him shaking his head. I know how emotional that can be. But then I also had to go out to a press conference after calling his widow about an hour and a half later, and knowing people needed their governor and needed me to be a unifier at that time, that we had the option of either bringing people together and hopefully making sure that my friend's life made a positive impact, moved our state in a positive direction. And I think right now the president is missing the moment. Again, he may be angry. I just felt empty and sad at the time. But still, he's the president, and we need him to make sure that we're bringing people together at a time like this.
And Governor, with all due respect, I mean, your friend, as tragic and heartbreaking and horrific as it wasn't a politically motivated shooting, or wasn't considered "quote unquote" political violence. Is that accurate?
Well, I think in a lot of these instances, people try to say it's a left or a right, and oftentimes it's a disaffected human being. And in the end, I don't want to give anybody an excuse that commits murder. I mean, if they have made the decision to do that, they're engaging in evil, and they can try to have these political or other reasons. But I think once you've decided that you're going to commit an act of evil, you got to own it. And I don't, and that's why, I understand the news coverage of the other pieces of it, but I don't want to give anybody who do this to another human being any excuse.
I think this has been very complicated, as you know, because, as I mentioned, Charlie Kirk was extremely controversial, and his views were very provocative and at times very, I don't even know how to describe it, insensitive, racist, homophobic, misogynistic. He espoused views that were very divisive in life. And he has been, in many ways, canonized in death. And I think it's a very hard thing to talk about, to cover as a journalist, to discuss, because you're right. A man has been killed, and who was a son and a husband and a father of 2 little children. On the other hand, when his death is discussed and the way he lived is discussed versus how he died, I mean, should people be looking at him holistically? Because many people think the rhetoric and the views he conveyed were not necessarily a positive force for society. So how do you kind of come to terms with that?
I think as long as we start any analysis with, as a human being, he deserved to go home to his family, and that his kids and wife deserve to have their dad and husband come home, then we can talk about his different views and whether they were positive or negative for America. But I don't think we can or should connect that to his death, which was a senseless act of violence that shouldn't occur to anybody.
Do you think that it risks somehow making people draw the conclusion that he somehow had it coming to him? If you point out some of his views that were quite repugnant to people, but certainly something as an American citizen who believes in the First Amendment within his right to espouse.
In my mind, it's just nobody ever has anything like that coming to them. That we can disagree. We can disagree significantly. We can believe each other's views are even dangerous to a country, but still want them to go home at the end of the day. And it's that idea that we should still, even if we disagree with someone, we should still want good things for their family. We should still want good things for for their kids. One of the, I think, things that makes America the great country that it is, or it should be, is the idea that we can have very different views, but at the end, we should still be able to wish each other well personally, because there's a lot of our lives that are outside the political piece. Think about the amount of each day that we have that's with family or friends, that we are just a lot more complicated than maybe what people will see through the videos. And so there are lots of things that Charlie Kirk said that I disagree with, but at the same time, those kids deserve their dad.
Right. And I'm not suggesting that there was any rational reason for this happening to him. I was just saying, is it a slippery slope and risky to talk about these things, because perhaps it will be interpreted by some that hate begets hate, right?
I think back to when Tommy Elliott, a great friend of mine, was killed at the Old National Bank shooting. I didn't want to read what that individual had left behind. I intentionally forgot his name, and I don't want anybody else out there to know his name. I mean, to me, it went through this very personally. He committed an unforgivable act, and there is nothing that rationalizes it. And I didn't want the world to hear his name or to hear his reasons, just to know that he was a murderer. And I know that might sound overly simplistic, but from a standpoint of someone who's going through that trauma and watching his family go through that trauma, I just didn't want to give him any excuse.
When terrible things like this happen, they provide a moment for a president to exhibit true leadership. And I'm curious how you would have addressed the nation following Charlie Kirk's assassination, and what you would have said to the American people at that moment.
I would have condemned all violence, this violent act, to make sure that we put this in human terms, because we have to see each other as human beings. We've got so much dehumanizing going on in politics, attempts to see portions of our population as less than human, less than deserving, maybe just less than. And I think one of the ways that we have to address a situation like this, but also the current state of our country, is to humanize everyone. To recognize, again, you can argue all you want, but that is another human being, on the other side of the table. To me, my faith is my driving why. It's what helps me make decisions. And that golden rule that you love your neighbor as yourself has no asterisks, has no exceptions. And it makes it hard and it makes it challenging. But my belief that that's what we're called on to do is how I try to respond in tough and difficult circumstances. And I think it's one of the reasons we see a little more unity in Kentucky, because we've been through more natural disasters than any other state in the last 5 years. I mean, we've seen hardships, but we've never addressed or responded to any of them as Democrats or Republicans. We've just responded to them as Kentuckians. And so if I'd have been in this position, it would have been calling on all of us as Americans to be better, to protect each other, to put our lives and well-being up above the politics, and to remind people that there are a lot of things, like going home to your kids at night, that are a lot more important than our current arguments.
J.D. Vance, the Vice President of the United States, and other senior administration officials guest hosted Charlie Kirk's podcast. They announced today a crackdown on liberal groups who Vance said were responsible for Kirk's death, even though officials say that this individual acted alone. As the New York Times put it, they spoke in vague and menacing terms about far-left groups that they said facilitated the violence. What's your reaction to that?
Well, they're missing the moment. They've got a moment to show true leadership, true statesmanship, to be the very best of who we are, to live out our faith and our values, and not to respond to this in a way that creates more us versus them. I think the fundamental concern that I have for our country right now is this intentional division where you try to turn one part of the population against another. I think it's against everything that we talk about being as Americans. I think about the Pledge of Allegiance, where we actually pledge, and we have our kids pledge to keep the country indivisible. We say that word in the middle of the pledge. So everything can't be about blaming this group or that group or putting half the country into a bucket and telling the other half that they should be upset with them. And it also, I don't think, respects individuals on any side of the political spectrum, because we're all so much more nuanced than just being left or right, Democrat, Republican, liberal, or conservative. We all have different views based on our life experiences. And so this attempt to just grab this, blame it on a group instead of an individual who created a horrific act, but then use it to again turn people against each other, I just think it's the wrong approach, and not what a tragedy like this should get out of us. I mean, a tragedy like this should remind us how important life is and how much we care about each other, not to make us care about each other less.
Why do you think they're raising the temperature instead of lowering it? Why do you think this is the kind of rhetoric we are hearing from Donald Trump and J.D. Vance?
You know, if I knew what was in their heart to respond this way, I'd hopefully be able to talk them out of it. Because in these moments, regardless of what party I am or the president or vice president are, we need the right response that brings people together, that turns down that temperature, that reminds us that we're Americans first and Democrats and Republicans second, third, or fourth. Or in my faith, I'd say we are children of God. And if we're all children of God, we're all each other's brothers and sisters. So let's make sure we don't take how we talk in politics or in government and use it in a way that separates people as opposed to bring them together. I mean, it's a very dangerous thing to start by trying to pit one part of the country against another. But then to have that rhetoric after a tragedy like this is not just concerning, but it's also a missed opportunity to do good. We just recognized 9/11, and I know that's very personal to you, having been on the air during it. The fire chief of Lexington talked in our ceremony about how 9/11 was a day of tragedy, but 9/12 was a day of unity. And I think regardless of how you viewed George W. Bush and his views, that day was a moment of unity where he stepped in and supported people that were hurting. Now, that's an example from a Republican president that I wish our current president and vice president would see.
It's interesting, though, when I think back on 9/11, that was a threat outside our country. And this seems to be a threat inside our country, among our own citizens, which makes it slightly different, doesn't it?
It's certainly different in that 9/11 impacted an entire city, was viewed as a terrorist attack, but it also was a moment where people could just support each other. And sadly, the way that Charlie Kirk was lost was so violent and so repugnant that I think it also presented an opportunity for people to say, all this has gone way too far. This is a guy who deserved to go home to his family, regardless of how we felt about his comments. And it's time to do better. I think we heard that out of Governor Spencer Cox. I think we've heard it out of a number of folks on the Democrat and Republican side. And so while I wish the president and the vice president's responses were different, I'm not saying that for a partisan reason. There is plenty of credit that can be given to Spencer Cox and a number of Republican officials and Democratic officials for stepping up and saying the right things for the right reasons because they care about people in this country.
I'd like to give you an opportunity as a very popular Democratic governor in a ruby red state to tell us how to fix this. First, how do we fix this very dangerous, pervasive, and I would say worsening political divide in this country? And secondly, after you fix that, Governor, how do we fix people's access to guns? You know, people point to mental health. Other countries have the same degree of mental health issues that the United States has. But other countries do not have the huge amount of gun violence and gun deaths as we do in this country. So first, how do you fix the political divide? Go.
When I think about fixing the political divide, I look back to 2019 when I ran for governor. We had a governor in Matt Bevin that was very similar to some of the things that you hear from President Trump. Was divisive, would attack different groups of people. And one of the reasons I decided to run is I didn't think it was a very good example to my kids or to anyone else's kids. My belief that you ought to be able to watch your governor, regardless of your political party, and not be either concerned or embarrassed. And so to me, it was very important to govern as an example, to govern in a way and to think about my words and my actions to where kids of parents of any political party or any bent, conservative or liberal, could say, okay, he's a good example for our kids to watch. I think part of that is how we go about these jobs, but another part is what we focus on. You know, you can focus on the things that divide us, or you can focus on the things that unify us. I'm convinced that most people aren't as political as we think they are. They're just worried about getting through the next day, the next week, and the next month, and whether they're going to leave their kids better off than they were left. And so I think we spend 80% of our time on issues that matter to 100% of people. And that's your job and whether you make enough to support your family. That's your next doctor's appointment. It's the roads and bridges you drive, the school you drop your kids off at, and whether you feel safe in your community. And we approach those in the most nonpartisan ways we can. We listen to ideas coming from different sides, but then we get actual results. And when we talk about them, we don't try to claim a win for a political party. We talk about how they're helping, every single American. In 2023, after governing that way, we saw, in 2024 even, after governing that way, 2023, I win by a lot more certainly than I did in 19. But in the 2024 presidential election in Kentucky, we didn't see the same arguments. We didn't see as many flags. We didn't see as many signs. The temperature had been turned down. We didn't see neighbors yelling at neighbors. And so I think what's important is that the next administration focuses as much on healing the country, setting the type of example, returning to norms. And I'm not talking about in government. I'm talking about as human beings. And part of that is being polite. Part of it's caring about people as people. Part of it's believing that being an American is more important than being a Democrat or a Republican. That's going to be as important for the person that follows this administration as anything else. And I will just say, I don't know what the future holds for me, but I after 2023 thought I was done. I was going to serve out 4 years as governor. I was going to have provided the best I have to the place that I'm from and that I love. And then I was going to find something where I could afford to send my kids to college. Right now, as I look at things, I just don't want to leave my kids or anybody else's a broken country. They deserve better than what we're seeing right now, and that's everyone's kids of any political party. Now, as your second question, it's a challenge in America. Certainly in my state, I think the next step we ought to take is a red flag law. I think it's a step that Florida's taken, which is red, and other places that are blue, and it just should make sense to everyone. Yes, there is a constitutional right under the Second Amendment, but the courts are who define what that constitutional right means. All a red flag law allows is law enforcement to go to the courts right before they believe a murder is going to be committed and stop it. And if we trust our courts deciding custody of our kids, certainly we can trust them here. I think the other thing that we've got to think about are requirements for gun locks, which certainly would have stopped some of what we've seen in my state and other places. But I think we need to at least start in places that we ought to be able to find agreement, and to start taking those steps, understanding that we cannot continue to see the number of school shootings or political assassinations or just the regular violence we see on a daily basis. I mean, we talk about political violence because of the importance of speech, but the person that dies being shot tomorrow in a non-political context is just as important to their family as anybody in politics.
Speaking of crime, how would you feel if Donald Trump deployed the National Guard to Louisville?
Well, I think that the National Guard being deployed to a state where the governor does not agree, number one, is not legal, but number two, it's not going to help in the long term. You have the Guard on the streets of a city. It may shrink crime in the short term, but at some point, they're going to leave. And you haven't changed anything for the longer term. I think what we have to do are some steps that we've taken here, but there's more work to be done. I was able to convince our General Assembly, Republicans working with me as a Democrat, to raise the salaries for our Kentucky State Police to record levels. And guess what happens? When you pay people more, you get more people willing to do it. We have the highest number of state police we've had in a long time. That's a step the DC mayor talks about wanting to take that could help in the long term. Second piece is we've worked on recidivism. The idea that we might not be able to stop the first crime someone commits, but when they're incarcerated, we can try to work to make sure they don't commit a second, third, or fourth. And that's everything from drug treatment, trying to get to the root of some of these crimes. It's teaching a skilled trade in each of our prisons. And we've got some of the lowest recidivism we've ever seen, which means people are safer. I think the third that's so important are the programs that intervene with at-risk youth. You know, we see more youth right now that are at risk of falling into violence than I can ever remember. And that means that some of the programs that are being cut from the federal levels are more important than ever. And we ought to be doing everything we can to figure out every moment we can intervene, especially with a young person, so that they don't go through this trauma and they don't inflict trauma on anyone else. So reducing crime is something we should all be for. And let me just say the response can't be, oh, no, you're safe. Look at the statistics. If Democrats are the party of mental health being just as important as physical health, if someone says they don't feel safe, we've got more work to do. But it's got to be one that gets results. It's got to be one that's based in steps that are going to help in the long term.
You're right. Somebody said crime isn't just statistics, it's a feeling. And I think that that's what you are sort of responding to. And I would just like to add, I don't have a lot of experience with the criminal justice system, but I do know that oftentimes when people are released from prison after spending many years incarcerated, the support system that exists is virtually non-existent. They're given bus money, a pat on the back, and a good luck, Mr. or Ms. And it seems to me that people need help, emotional help, financial help, educational help in adjusting to life, quote unquote, on the outside. And I don't understand why there aren't more programs to help with that.
There are two ways to view it that both get you to the same answer. There is the faith, humanity, values that says second chances are important and we are not our worst moment. And then there is the practical reduction of crime, where you look at the statistics about how many people who are released commit another crime, and you say, how do we stabilize that person's life to prevent crime number 2, 3, and 4? Because if you've done that, people are a lot safer, and that's what we're working on right now. So how do you teach somebody a skill? How, during the last period of their incarceration, do you get them their GED? How do you place them in a good job? How do you get them through addiction treatment, and maybe when they come out into recovery or supportive housing? All of that is worth it if our people out there are a little bit safer. And then remember, doing all that likely gets them back with their family, helps kids out there that may have been missing a dad or a mom have a healthy, productive role model that can show them in that second chance what it's like to be a responsible adult.
Are we putting enough emphasis on those kinds of programs? I guess my question is.
We are in Kentucky. It's one of our flagship initiatives, but around the country, we ought to just see this as being a step to take for public safety. The idea that just about any crime that's being committed, we can look at and say, this person committed before, and this person committed before that. And one way you look at it is, well, should they have been released or probated? Well, most people are going to be released at some point. I think the next thing we ought to say is, are there steps that we can take while they're incarcerated, while they're in jail, that reduces the likelihood that this ever happens? Because maybe that next person isn't the victim of a violent crime because we did something smart.
And when they're released, I would add, not only during their time, but also support after they're released. I have one last question. I know you got to go, but I really appreciate your time. But I'm very curious. You seem like such a nice guy, Governor Beshear. You seem really sweet and normal and mild-mannered. But what we've been seeing lately is a lot more combative rhetoric coming from members of your party. It seems like we're seeing a lot less of Michelle Obama's when they go low, we go high approach, and a lot more of when they go low, we go just as low, if not lower. And I'm curious to hear your take on this more aggressive, combative rhetoric we're seeing from some Democrats across the country who are saying no more Mr. Nice Guy or no more Ms. Nice Gal. We're going to have to be much more aggressive, and our rhetoric has got to match the Republicans. What do you think of that?
I think each of those leaders is trying to stand up for their people. And they may be doing it in different ways, but they're trying to put the people of their states and the United States of America first. You know, I don't think people should confuse the fact that I try to be nice and polite with whether I'm tough or not. I've sued this administration multiple times and won. I've got dollars flowing to Kentucky that aren't flowing anywhere else. I mean, I called out this president on numerous occasions, and I've got a 68% approval rating in a state that the president won by 30 points. But where I come from is it's always going to be about what I think is right versus what I think is wrong, what I think is best for the people that I signed up to serve. And I think ultimately that you don't battle cruelty with more cruelty. You battle it with humanity. So for me, I've governed through a pandemic, and I've governed through more natural disasters than any governor of Kentucky has ever seen. And I've seen people at their very best, and that's who they are at their core. For me, that's what I want to speak to. I want to try to lift people up, to recognize their goodness, and to ultimately move this country to a place of healing. And I think the way we've got to come about that is one of empathy and of kindness, or maybe the most simplistic way I can describe it to you is, you know, my Savior had the opportunity to be the Prince of Power, but chose to be the Prince of Peace. And so I think that is the ultimate strength.
So am I right to assume that you're not a fan of Gavin Newsom trolling the president mercilessly on social media?
Well, I'm a fan of what Gavin is doing to stand up on this redistricting. I think that he has taken a really courageous step that is important, and I support him. If this is how Governor Newsom believes that he is standing up for the people of California, he's their governor, and I want to respect that. But it's just not me. For me, I want to make sure that that I'm setting a tone here that has us in the place we are in Kentucky, with really good things happening, and in a pessimistic country having a pretty optimistic state.
Governor Andy Beshear, I want to be respectful of your time. I have a lot more questions, but I know you're a busy man, so thanks so much for making the time to talk with me today.
And thanks for having me on.